This is Joe with Cloud First Labs, here to show how to integrate with Gmail API using MuleSoft. Gmail offers a lot of different API methods for handling email-related operations, and MuleSoft is very well positioned to integrate with these APIs. There's a lot of documentation, but it can be a little bit confusing without context. So this is going to be a little how-to video along with an article on how to do this. To get started, we are going to do some configuration inside of Google. So we're going to go to console.cloud.google.com and log in with this CFL testing account. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and, as a first step, create a billing account. So if I come to the hamburger menu, billing, manage billing accounts, add billing account, notice this is going to take in credit card information, so be careful with this. There is a $300 credit for free, and it should allow you, there should be no auto charge after the free trial ends. But anyway, just be aware that you are creating a billing account by doing this and could incur charges depending on what you do within this account. But let's say I create a new account here, and I'll enter some personal information. And after this, I'm going to create a payment method, add a payment method. And of course, I will blur this out. And I don't plan on actually incurring any charges, but I do need to set this up for demonstration purposes. Some of this Google account setup may work differently in a corporate environment connecting to a corporate Gmail setup, but for these purposes, I'm just using a personal account. So now I've got a billing account set up, starting for free. And now within here, I'm going to create a new project. And so I'm going to come here. And new project. Joe Mule Gmail demo project. Create. And now I'm going to select this from the drop down, make sure this is the one that I'm using. Within here, I'm going to go to APIs and services. Now within this project, I need to enable the Gmail API. Enable. Now that I'm here, I need to create credentials for this Gmail API. So I click Create Credentials, and in this case, we want user data because we're doing data belonging to a Google user, like their email address. That's what we're going to use in this case, is an email address for sending emails. So I'm going to give this an app name. I'm going to call it Joe Gmail Demo App. And I'm going to use my joecfltesting@gmail.com as the user support email. Likewise, I am going to do that for the developer contact information. Save and continue. Now we have scopes. Let's add scopes. In this case, we are going to, let's find the Gmail API related scopes. And we're going to do an example here, sending an email. So I'm going to use this auth gmail.modify scope, which allows for read, compose, and send emails from your Gmail account. So I'll hit update there. We're going to see it show up under our Gmail scopes. Save and continue. Okay, OAuth client ID. So now we're going to create the actual client ID and client secret that will be used by our Mule application to authenticate to this Gmail API. Application type is going to be web application. I'm going to call it Joe Mule Gmail OAuth app or OAuth client. And then for an authorized redirect URI, I'm going to do HTTP localhost 8081 callback. So this is going to be important when configuring our Mule application in a little bit. This is where, when you do the authorization code flow, it requires manual authorization to get an authorization code back, which then is used in combination with the client ID and client secret to get an access token. The access token is what is used to actually call the Gmail API. Well, as part of that flow that brings back the authorization code, we need to go in the browser, log into Google, and it needs to know where to send that authorization code back to once you're done providing authorization. And that's what this is. We're going to provide it back. We're saying if someone requests an authorization code, we're saying they're allowed to use this as a redirect URI. So this is what we're going to use from our local host. We're going to have to come back and touch this later when we deploy to CloudHub, because we're going to need to be able to use the CloudHub URI, the CloudHub URL as an authorized redirect URI. But we know for our local testing, we'll need to do this. So localhost 8081/callback. Click create. This is going to create credentials for us. We're going to use these and configure these into our MuleSoft application in a little bit from Anypoint Studio. So for right now, I'm going to click download. That's going to download the client ID, the client secret, and a couple of URLs that are important. It's going to download those to a JSON file. So we see that it did that. Now I click done. Okay, we've created those credentials. We are now almost set up, but we do need to do one more thing. We need to come here to the OAuth consent screen and add a test user, because we haven't published this app yet. Joe Mule Gmail demo app that we just created. We haven't published it yet. So while it's in test, you have to explicitly name the users who are allowed to use this. So only certain users will be allowed to authorize to this app and use the Gmail API through this app. So I'm going to just set it up so that joecfltesting@gmail.com is allowed to use this app for connecting to the Gmail API. If I tried to log in with another Gmail account, it would not authorize me. So this, while it's in this testing phase, only this account will be able to access this. With that in mind, our Google configuration is complete for right now, and it's time to start building our application in Anypoint Studio. Here we are within Anypoint Studio. Let's go ahead and create a new Mule project. I'm going to name this example demo Gmail SAPI for System API, and here we go. So we have our blank canvas here to start from. I'm going to start out with an HTTP listener. I'm going to put this on /email as the path. And I'm going to have this listen just on HTTP port 8081. Okay, so we have this in place. The first thing we need to do is add the Gmail module. So let's search in Exchange. We're going to search in Exchange. We're going to look for Gmail, and we're going to add the Gmail connector. Finish. Hey, look at all that. We've got a whole bunch of good stuff. What we are going to use for our specific example, we're going to use the send message component from this list. But you can see there are lots and lots and lots of Gmail API options here. But we want the send message in this case. And for user ID, in a real API, you're going to, parameterize this and, put it in your properties or something along those lines. But I'm just going to go ahead and hard code values in for simplicity's sake. So I'm going to put my user ID is joecfltesting@gmail.com. And now I'm going to configure a Gmail connector. So it fills out a lot of this for us, so we can leave most of this the same, but we are going to make some modifications, like consumer key and consumer secret. In our downloads, we downloaded a JSON file that has these values. It's got a client ID. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, paste it in, and a client secret. I'm going to copy that from my JSON file and paste it in. Again, these are better to be done as properties so that they're not just hard-coded in, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just hard-coding in these values. And then for scopes, I'm going to limit it. We don't need all of these different scopes. We just need the one that we set up within the Google console, which was the modify scope. So I'm going to grab that and put it in here. So we just need the modify scope. So we will do that here, googleapis.com/auth/gmail.modify. Now we get to the interesting part, the OAuth callback config. So this is part of that OAuth authorization code flow where we need to authorize our application to use the Gmail API. So we're going to have to hit an authorize endpoint as a user. It'll be a manual step to provide authorization. And then once, from there, it goes to Google. And, Google makes sure we enter like our proper username and password, all of that we do provide authorization to use the Gmail API. And once we do provide that, they've got to send the authorization code back to a callback path. So we are going to set these up here. And, for the callback path, we are going to just do callback. For authorize, it's going to be authorized. But external callback URL here, we are going to set a property, app.callback URL. The reason we're going to do this is because locally we're going to have this callback to localhost 8081/callback. But when this deploys to CloudHub, we're going to want to be able to parameterize that to set it as a property and use the actual CloudHub URL. So that will be a property value. So for right now, we're going to just parameterize this with that this property name. We'll have to set this later on. And then OAuth store config, we do want an object store set up for this, so I'm going to add. Oh, okay, and because we don't already have the object store connector, we need to do one more step. So I'll save my changes here so far, and then also I'm going to search in Exchange for the object store connector. And I'm going to add that, bring in that dependency. Now, if we go back to where we just were in the Gmail connector config, and we want to set up an object store, now this will work. And I'm just going to name this OAuth object store, and I'm going to leave it as is. The key point is that this is a persistent object store. So it's going to persist even when the application is down. So from CloudHub 2.0, that's going to use an object store v2 object store. Okay, so we have our Gmail connector configuration set up. We've got a send message in place, but what we haven't done yet is set the actual payload to send to this Gmail API. So that's going to be our next step. I'm going to show two different ways to set this payload. It's kind of personal preference. You can do it either through DataWeave, which will do the job, or you can use a Java class that handles the setup and invoke it as a static Java class. I prefer that method only because in this case, the Gmail API, it's kind of hard to tell from their documentation, but they take a very specific type of payload, and that's an RFC 2822 style email message as a payload. And we're also going to base 64 encode that before we send it over. So anyway, I'm going to show you how to do this using DataWeave briefly, and then I'll come back around and switch it to use Java, which is more my preferred choice in this instance, just because there are libraries that you can use that do this. Like you don't have to kind of recreate the wheel in DataWeave like I'm doing here. But in any case, I am going to go ahead and recreate the wheel here and show the DataWeave way. I'm going to go ahead and paste my my DataWeave transform in here, but what you're going to see is we're going to find the to email string, and we do some DataWeave transformation on that, separating the list of to emails by semicolons. So we will use that down in here. And what you're going to see, we're going to have a text plain output, and it's going to have a bunch of this information. We've got lots of line separators here, but we're going to set the content type, the mod version, from, to, subject. So this is all in accordance with RFC 2822. And, we set this up, and then we're grabbing, information from the payload that's passed in. And the payload that gets passed in is going to look something like, let me open up a notepad here and show what an example payload is. Just in this case, it could be whatever your use case needs, but this is what I'm building from. So the input message is going to have a from email, to emails as an array, subject, email body, and then an array of attachments. So that's what we're parsing out down here. And you see we've got like these boundary separators. We're adding those. And ultimately it's building an RFC 2822 message. And then we also need to add one additional step. We need one more transform after this to to get the base 64 version of that string. And we're going to pass that in a JSON object with the JSON key raw. So that is what the Gmail API expects. So in this case, I'm going to say base 64 encode raw email. And what I didn't do before, instead of setting this equal to the payload, I'm gonna set this on equal to a variable named raw email. And so I'm gonna set raw email to be RFC 2822 email message content. And then this will take the that raw email, base 64 encode it, stick it in a raw payload, and send it here. So let's add a breakpoint and let's run this. I'm going to, instead of run it, debug it. So yes, we want to save, and I'll let this start up and pull up Postman. We'll fast forward. I forgot to do something before starting up. I did not set that app.callback.url property on the application, so it failed to deploy. So let's go ahead and do that here. I'm gonna come to debug as, debug configurations, and in environment, I'm going to add app.callback.url and set it equal to localhost 81 callback. And apply and debug. So now I will redeploy this and we'll fast forward to when it has started up. We are back. It has deployed successfully this time. So are we ready to make a call to the API? Not yet. Because of that authorization code OAuth flow that is in place for the Gmail APIs, before we can actually call this API, well, let's see what happens if we try to call it. So I've got breakpoints set. OAuth, boom, we get back an error message. And I'm going to add one more breakpoint for when we truly run. But OAuth authorization dance not yet performed for resource owner ID null. Okay, what does that mean? It means we need to authorize our API. To do that, we go to that authorized endpoint, so localhost 8081/authorize. And now we're going to log in to Google. It's saying Google hasn't verified this app. It's not a published app. It was still in the testing phase when we were looking at the Google console earlier. Click continue. I'm going to allow this and successfully retrieved access token. Okay, and where did it send it back to? It sent it back to that localhost 8081 callback URL that we just configured as a property, and it passed this authorization code back along with the scope. So now, the Gmail connector configuration has what it needs to connect to the Gmail API. The connector is going to handle the rest under the covers with all the configurations we have done. So now we are ready to send a request. And let's see this in action. So the raw email, what does that look like? Let's look at the raw email. All right, so here's what we generated with our DataWeave. So this is an RFC 2822 compliant email message. And now we're going to run it through the step to base 64 encode it. And so we see now our payload has raw, and then it's got that whole message that we just looked at. It's base 64 encoded, and now it's going to send it to the Gmail API with this send message. And let's see what our Postman response is. All right, this is what the Gmail API returned, and our Mule API didn't transform it or anything. It just sent it back as is. And So it says sent. And because I sent this to my own email, hey, there it is. Here is the email message that was sent. And this matches, Joe was here. Here is some normal text. And here is a link. And it's got an attachment. So you can see that this successfully uses the Gmail API to send a request. So that's great. That does exactly what we want. But I also mentioned, there's another way to do it besides using DataWeave. So let's set it up that other way just to, compare the two ways. I am going to come here and I'm going to add a Java class. So first I'll add a package. I'm going to do com.cfl.gmail.sappy. And within this, I'm going to create a new file called raw email builder.java. And I'm going to paste it. Now, why do I do this here? I do this because there's this javax.mail class that, it's tried and true. It does this type of thing. It builds email messages out of Java objects. So rather than reinventing the wheel like I did in the DataWeave that we looked at earlier, here I'm going to depend on this javax.mail dependency, this library, and we're going to let Java do that work. Before we do anything else, I mentioned that javax.mail dependency in the library. We need to add that as a dependency into our POM file here. So let's scroll down and add that. Scroll down, and here's our dependency. We're going to add a dependency for com.sun.mail, javax.mail 1.6.2. So that's just going to give us access to take advantage of these classes that the static Java class is using to build out the email message. So we come back over here. Now we need to add an invoke static. So if we search Java, invoke static, so instead of that DataWeave that we had earlier, now we're going to use an invoke static. What class are we going to use? We're going to use the raw email builder class that we just created. And it's only got one method, and here it is. It auto-filled for us. But we do need to set the arguments. To set the arguments, we are going to just create a basic object with from email, to emails, subject, email body, and attachments, and set each of those from the incoming payload. And you'll see that those names match up to from email, to emails, subject, email body, and attachments. So that's what we're setting here in our invoke static. With that, I'm going to save. Before we redeploy, I need to do one more thing in this invoke static. Right now, this would set the output from that static Java method. It would set it equal to the payload, or it would set the payload equal to that output. We want to set that equal to our raw email variable, because that's what we base 64 encode in the next step. So we will do that, save, and now debug this application. We'll fast forward to when it has deployed. Okay, we're back. We have successfully deployed. We see we're now in the Mule debug view. We've got a breakpoint set right after this invoke static. And let's send another message from Postman. This time I'm just going to add a to_ onto the front of this subject just to differentiate it from the previous send that we had. And I'm going to send it. And okay, so we've just stepped over this invoke static. Let's see what our raw email looks like at this point. All right, you see it is still an RFC 2822 compliant email message. And then we base 64 encode it here. And we now have this raw output, and then we send it through the API. We get back this success response, and what we should see any second here is a new email in the inbox. And there it is. Goes here, header 2, it's got the 2 underscore sample HTML email with attachment. So that demonstrates that it works either with DataWeave or with JavaX, with the static Java invocation. Now that we have seen the application run locally, let's deploy it to dev in CloudHub 2.0. So I'm going to name this, I'm going to prefix it with CFL, example, demo, Gmail, SAPI. And I need to export this. While the application builds, let's set a couple of things. I want to show this running on multiple replicas, and to call out a couple of the properties we want to set when we run on multiple replicas. One is runtime cluster mode. We want to do this to share memory so it can share the authorization code that it receives back in the OAuth code flow. If you don't do runtime cluster mode, you're going to have to authorize on each and every replica, and that's a real pain. So if you run in runtime cluster mode, they're going to share memory. You just have to authorize once upon deployment. On a similar note, use object store v2. This will utilize, we've got a persistent object store set up to hold the OAuth related information. And by using object store v2, that's going to persist even between deployments. So, if we deploy and then redeploy for some reason in the near future, we won't have to reauthorize upon that redeployment. The application via object store v2 will be able to get the authorization information out and just use that instead of needing to reauthorize. So these are two key settings to configure for this application, really for any application using an OAuth 2.0 authorization code flow. With that, we do still need to add the file, but I'm going to add a couple of settings here, a couple of properties, just for my environment. Of course, I'm going to blur out the values here, but we've got to set our anypoint, platform, client ID, and client secret. And I will protect these values. And now we can come back here. We see we still have everything set. The application should be built now. Let's find it. Example, demo, Gmail, SAPI, and deploy. We will still have one additional thing to set. One on the application side, one on the Google side, but that's going to be dependent on some information we get back after this starts to deploy. So we'll check back in a minute. Okay, so let's grab that value that we care about here. If we find example demo Gmail SAPI, all right, we want this public endpoint URL. What do we want this for? We need to set it up on both sides as the callback URL or the redirect URI, in the Google side. So how do we do this? We come over here to the Google Cloud. Let's start back at the beginning. We go into the Gmail demo project, and we go into APIs and services. Within here, we're going to go to credentials. And now we're going to edit the existing OAuth client. Right now, it would only allow the callback to go back to to localhost 8081/callback. We need to authorize one additional URL now that we know what it is from CloudHub. We need that CloudHub URL/callback. And, so we're going to save that. So this is where it's going to fire back the authorization code too, as part of that OAuth code flow. So, on a similar note, we are going to have to do the same thing. I think if we look here, it couldn't find app.callback.url, so it failed to deploy. Well, we need to set that value, and we needed the value from CloudHub to be able to set it. Now we have that value, so let's come here and go app.callback.url, paste this value, and apply our changes, and now it should deploy successfully. We will check back once it has deployed. The application has now deployed. We can see the running status up here, so we are good to go. So let's check it out in Postman, send a request to it, and if you recall from what we did in our localhost, this first request is going to fail. But let's go through the process. So we duplicate the message that works successfully on our localhost. I'm going to swap out this URL with the CloudHub URL. So we're sending it to this CloudHub URL/email. We've got this payload. I'm going to change the 2 to a 3. I'll go ahead and save this, and now send it. Sending the request. Oh, of course, the OAuth authorization dance not yet performed. So how do we perform that dance? Well, let's call that CloudHub URL/authorize. That's going to take us to Google. I'm going to sign in to the Gmail account that is going to be used to send the email. I'm going to grant access. And because we configured this as a runtime property, it passes it back to the CloudHub URL/callback. So we had to do that on both sides. We had to allow that URL on the Google side as an authorized redirect URI, and we had to set it up in Runtime Manager as a runtime property for the application. So successfully retrieved access token. So now the application has the authorization code. It's got everything it needs to send this request. So let's try this one more time. Send. And we get a successful response. And I think within a few seconds, we should see a little pop-up here showing that I have a new email. So let's wait. There it is. 3_sample HTML email. So that is the set of steps that you can use to configure the Gmail API into a MuleSoft application. And we took care of most of the work. After this, you can go through, you can add all of those different Gmail components. These are all using different API resources on the Google side. You can use any of these. And now that the authorization is handled, that's going to be in place and able to be reused for any of these that we add in here. And we could add any kind of orchestration that we wanted because MuleSoft gives you lots and lots of options. So thank you for sticking with me through this, and hopefully you learned something about integrating with the Gmail APIs using MuleSoft. Thank you for your time, and just contact us at Cloud First Labs if you have any needs for MuleSoft integration. Thank you very much.